Ukraine, a decently sized Eastern European nation, is often in the news these days. As a nation stuck between the West and the East, it has found itself in conflict ever since Euromaidan made it take deep decisions on its position in the world. Since the Russian annexation of Crimea and its separatist sponsoring in eastern Ukraine, Ukrainians have to a larger and larger degree sided with the West. A large section of the population these days favor joining the EU and joining NATO. Especially the government has again and again pleaded for this nation to be able to join the NATO Membership Action Plan that would enable it to over time join NATO and gain the support and backing it seeks. Turkey has been one of the biggest sponsors of this, but also other Eastern European nations have favored this to some degree, such as Poland and the Baltics, as they relate to Ukraine's need to seek protection from Russia, as well as wants pressure to be taken off from themselves. NATO has been very positive about this change in Ukrainian politics and the pivot towards the West, but they also have been reluctant to let Ukraine in. They say that Ukraine is an aspirant country and that we support them, and especially to modernize and refine their defense and security installations, civilian political control over their security services, and not least fighting corruption. But to agree on the Membership Action Plan, you need consensus among 30 allies, and this has not come yet. While Russia is not very positive of Ukraine joining NATO, it is not a decision without pros and cons for the West and the rest of NATO, as it means securing Ukraine politically within the West and giving them room to breathe and reform, alongside the increased ties that NATO means, effectively removing them from Russia's sphere of influence that's lasted centuries, and putting them within the West towards an EU trajectory. Perhaps this is a decision that could be compared to letting Turkey join NATO during the Cold War. This brought Turkey solidly into the sphere of influence, and it's also caused a lot of issues over the years. It has the potential to halt all new military conflict in Ukraine and limit the current separatist Russia-funded states in the east. The hope is here that as NATO can back them up, that the conflict will not spread further and Russia will back off. It also removes the reason for the separatist states to exist, namely locking Ukraine in a conflict so they won't be allowed to join NATO, possibly making it so Russia gives up on them and allows them to instead reunite with Ukraine and regain voting privileges. You note that there's no current NATO country that has any separatist forces within at this point in history. It also means a Ukraine with a potential for a better economy and rescued from its current failed limbo of armed neutrality, which is given up. Perhaps one in which they can more easily trade their West natural resources, and it moves pressures away from other NATO countries such as Poland, the Baltics, and much of Eastern Europe, and moves it to Ukraine instead. This is one of the reasons why Poland and Turkey is so vocal in their support for Ukraine. If ever deemed suitable for both parties, it will also mean an easier accession process for joining the NATO, and that NATO gains a committed member, with plenty of Black Sea coastline. The Black Sea is a significant geostrategic point in the region for both the Russian Federation, Ukraine and Turkey, and NATO. By observing the Black Sea, they can monitor military and trade ship, and until the loss of the Crimean Peninsula, Ukraine had the longest coastline of the Black Sea. The Russian Black Sea Fleet is situated in Sevastopol, which is highly important for Russia. By allowing Ukraine to join, and that would mean more coastline for which NATO can counteract any Russian aggression. Cons is that it removes a buffer state and replaces it with a conflict-torn nation. There's also no guarantee that Russia won't escalate things and the conflict in the east won't worsen. This move will worsen relations with Russia, and it may cause Russian paranoia of invasion. Also risk causing, like I mentioned earlier, military escalation, especially in the period preceding NATO accession, potentially a war. And it raises questions of how committed individual NATO countries are to protect far-off NATO countries. NATO doesn't want to be perceived as a paper tiger. One of the things to note with these things is that if NATO is so committed that it wants Ukraine to join, it also, if you make this, it makes sense to admit Georgia as well as Ukraine if they join, as that would be another country that Russia has been fiercely against. Also means cutting off Russian support to Transnistria, the prop-up state in Moldova, and perhaps an end to the conflict there. All in all, joining NATO from a Ukrainian perspective, especially from the government's perspective, is very positive. There's a reason why they're doing it, and they will get a lot out of it in military tech, backup support, and it will clear things up for good. But joining from a NATO perspective is more mixed. It means bringing conflicts to NATO, and it means certain criticism. It also means that NATO will have to commit more resources to its east. But the hope is that just like East Germany was at one point integrated with West Germany, that Eastern Ukraine will be a quiet and peaceful part of Ukraine. One possible compromise will be to let Ukraine into NATO, but not for Article 5 to cover Crimea and certain parts of eastern Ukraine. This would hopefully prevent further piecing up of Ukrainian territory and mark clearly to Russia that its actions will not be tolerated. It also allow Ukraine to be motivated to do the necessary reforms and bring it into the NATO fold. This is not unprecedented, as a similar thing is discussed for Georgia, and Article 5 has never, since its funding, covered anywhere in the southern hemisphere. Thank you. This is Leo from The Swedish Historian. Hope you enjoyed this video and feel free to leave any comments, like and subscribe. Thank you.